Okay. Testing. Is that working? Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural labor lecture. I'm Ben Nilsson. I'm the head of the Department of History and Sociology here at UBC Okanagan, one of the two sponsors of this lecture, along with the North Okanagan Labor Council. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out on such a lovely evening. I know it's a sacrifice given what it's like out there, so thank you. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. And shortly, Louis Aguiar, who is the member of our department who's done all the work of organizing this, will introduce the speaker of the night. But first, I'd like to introduce Ian Gordon, who represents the North Okanagan Labor Council.
Thank you. And thanks again for coming out as well. I'd like to explain who we are. North Okanagan Labor Council is a council made up of a bunch of unions, both public and private, that are all associated with the Canadian Labor Congress, which is the biggest union organization in the country. We get together and we do events like this. We do Labor Day. They have mornings coming up. We just had International Women's Day. So there's a lot of activities that we do in the community. I do a lot of charity work. And we support strikes and protests as well. It's a big part of our job. But tonight we're having the first lecture. So hopefully it goes well. And there should be more in the future. So once again, thanks a lot for coming out, and I'll pass the torch.
Hi everyone. Thanks. My thanks too for you to come out here. To you for coming out here, and I'm excited about the presentation and having Dr. Strauss here, whom I will introduce in a minute. Before I do that, there are a few people that I need to thank, because without them this wouldn't have been possible. At UBC, I'd like to thank Dr. Ruth Frost, who was the former head of the History and Sociology Department and who was behind this initiative from the beginning. Dr. Ben Nilsson, who is now the head, and his support for this initiative. Anwar Granal, who's the administrative admin assistant in the department, who's done a lot of behind-the-scene work in putting this together. All of the legwork is hers, and I thank her very much for that. Without her, it would have been much more difficult to put this on. There are two students who are helping us out. Cormac Caceres, who is our photographer. He also helped to hang up posters and has been involved from an early stage of planning this. And on the other corner, we have Belle Shabat, who's also an undergraduate student, who also helped hang up posters, and he's doing the recording today, and is a, I don't know, monitor liquor police downstairs after the presentation. And then we have to thank Jill Heron, who is the caterer, and her staff for putting on the reception later on, in the snacks and the drinks. Malcolm Petch, Gustavo, and Brian from IT for helping with the technical stuff. So thanks to them. And then from the North Okanagan Labor Council, I have to thank Ian, because without Ian and his leadership on this, we wouldn't have put this together. So thanks, Ian. And also some members of his former executive, in particular Louise Gibson and Kelly Hutchinson, who are also very much sort of involved in this idea and developing this idea. And finally, I want to welcome Nicole Cabrejos from the North Okanagan Labor Council, who's the new president of the council. So thank you for coming, Nicole. So I am really thrilled and excited to have Dr. Strauss present the inaugural labor lecture here at UBCO. Dr. Strauss is the director of the Labor Studies program at Simon Fraser University, a distinguished SFU professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. She is, however, trained in geography and political economy. Teaching interests and research interests are in the areas of labor and regulation, social reproduction, migration, and urbanization. Her research focuses on the ways that categories of social difference shape how wage labor and unpaid work are valued and regulated, and what counts as labor. She co-directs with senior economist Iglika Ivanova from the Center for Policy Alternatives in the Vancouver office, the Understanding Precarity in BC SHIRK partnership, from which the talk will stem. Dr. Strauss, thank you. And let's join me in welcoming Dr. Strauss to present tonight.
Thanks, Luis. Thanks, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Luis and Ian and Louise and everyone who made this happen. I feel very honored to be asked to give the inaugural lecture. So I don't think I need to say anything more about myself, other than I'll just say that I am visiting today from the stolen and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, in particular the Esquimalt Nation in what is colonially known as Vancouver Island. I've only been to Kelowna once, so it's great to be here on such a sunny day. And as Luis mentioned, I'm going to be doing kind of two main things today. I'm going to be talking a bit about the partnership and the research that comes out of it, that Luis is also involved with, that really focuses on precarity in British Columbia and what it is and what it looks like, and the role of labor and organized labor in trying to combat precarity and to struggle for decent work. And then I'm going to be talking about kind of the ways in which we struggle against precarity and what organizing kind of looks like, and maybe what we as a labor movement need to be thinking about in the current moment that we're in. And hence the A World on Fire. I'm sure everybody has seen the headlines that we've just come out of the warmest winter ever on record. But, you know, we're also in a time of huge geopolitical turmoil, of war, of genocidal violence, including the legacies of settler colonialism, not only here in Canada, but in places like Palestine. And so it's a moment to really be thinking about what precarity looks like and for whom and what the costs are. So I'm going to start, this is just kind of an overview of how the talk is going to go. I'm going to start by explaining actually what it is that we're studying when we study precarity. So what does this partnership aim to understand and to tell us about working people in BC, and what work looks like and who benefits and who doesn't in our kind of changing economy? So I'm going to spend probably at least the first half of the presentation, because I've got some data to present from a couple of surveys. And as I mentioned, I'm also going to talk a little bit about what precarity is and how we study it. And then I'm going to kind of, in a sense, take us up a level to actually think about how precarity within British Columbia is situated within a broader set of kind of macro processes that we can see operating at a higher level, both kind of within Canada, but also globally. So thinking about us in BC as workers, not only positioned relative to other workers in BC and in Canada, but in a kind of broader set of processes. And out of that, I'm going to talk about kind of coalitional organizing for livable futures. And this is really, and in doing that, I'm kind of setting us up, I hope, for a discussion and maybe some questions about what the role of the labor movement is as a progressive and radical movement that really aims to make people's, you know, working people's lives better and to struggle for more just futures. So I'm going to try and cover all of that and then hopefully leave some time for questions and discussion at the end. Okay. So this photograph is taken from a big rally from the Justice for Janitors campaign to organize janitors and sanitation workers and cleaners. And it's often ununionized workers in sectors like janitorial and domestic work that we think about when we think about precarious employment. And so what do I mean when I talk about precarity or precarious employment? Can I just see a quick show of hands? How many people have heard the word precarity before? Okay, most of you. How many of you could define precarious employment if I asked you? Well, that's pretty good. That's more than most of the students in my classes when I asked them on the first day. So that's great. Sorry, yeah. Anyways, I'll spend a little bit of time on this, but it does mean I can probably go through it a little bit more quickly. I never like to take for granted that people know what I'm talking about when I talk about precarity or precarious employment. And as I'll come on to, I think one of the challenges around doing research and organizing around precarity is sometimes the language that we use and what people understand by precarity and precarious employment. So I'll start by saying that when we talk about precarity, we're actually talking potentially about 3 different ways of understanding distinct but interrelated kind of processes or experiences. So as the first bullet point says, many of us associate precarity with precarious employment or precarious work in particular. So, that is work that tends to be insecure. It's often work that's low paid. It's work that doesn't come with benefits. It's often not unionized. And we have a general sense, as well as I'll come on to, pretty good research that suggests that these kinds of jobs have increased in Canada since the 1990s. So there's that part of it. And many of us are familiar with this from our own communities and our own experiences of work. There's also an understanding of precarity, which comes from a more kind of academic tradition, in particular feminist philosophy and queer theory. It's associated with the work of Judith Butler, whom some of you might know, who's kind of quite a well-known gender theorist. And it also draws on, in a sense, sometimes without acknowledging them, unfortunately, kind of relational approaches that we also can recognize, for example, from Indigenous theory and Indigenous approaches to kind of understanding vulnerability and responsibility. And it understands precarity in a relational sense as shared vulnerability. So we all have bodies. We all need the material conditions of life. We all need social connection. We need these things. And in that sense, we share a common precarity. But we also tend to live in societies, and those societies have institutions and systems that distribute the risks of precarity and protections against it unequally. So precarity both refers to this sense of a shared and common vulnerability that can be a basis for a solidaristic politics, but also the way that the sort of impacts of precarity or the vulnerabilities associated with it tend to be unequally distributed within our society. The third kind of approach to precarity, which is one that I think we're seeing increasingly in both academic and political work, recognizes, in a sense, both of these different traditions of kind of politics and of research and knowledge production, and tries to understand precarity as a multidimensional phenomenon that exists within and beyond paid work. So when we're trying to study multidimensional precarity, we're often looking at social and cultural dimensions of precarity, but we might also be looking at things like housing policy, for example. We might also be looking at the provision of healthcare. And so understanding the different ways that our systems and institutions render us precarious or protect us from precarity. So related to this, and I won't spend a ton of time on this, but for those of you who are interested and maybe haven't kind of come across the different intellectual and research traditions around precarity, there are a couple of different ways that we theorize and study it. So on the one hand, we have a set of academic literatures and research from fields like political economy, feminist and queer theory, socio-legal studies, critical health studies, that help us kind of conceptualize and theorize. So how is it that we think about precarity? And how do we kind of come up with ways of knowing that help us identify and categorize it? There's also a very well-developed and very useful body of policy and legal literature that tries to understand how policies and legal systems either address precariousness or in some cases make it worse. So examples of this would be research on precariousness that really emerged in the late 1980s from the International Labour Organization, the ILO, that actually first identified the trends in what was called non-standard work, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And that was a precursor to understanding precarious employment as something that was becoming more pervasive, in particular in so-called developed or minority world economies. So the wealthier economies of the global north. It's worth saying and making the point that scholars from outside of the kind of Anglo-European tradition, so people like Ronaldo Monk, have been making the point for quite some time that in most parts of the world and for certain groups of people, precariousness is nothing new, right? So we can think about the prevalence of informal employment, for example. So a statistic that's often quoted is that 95% of all work in India is in the informal sector. So when we think about precariousness as something new, we just need to be conscious of kind of what perspective we're studying it from. It certainly is the case that this body of work on kind of labor and employment law, employment and social welfare policy, immigration policies, and changing migration policies have pointed out very real and significant shifts associated with economic restructuring and the security of employment in countries like Canada, especially from about the mid to late 1980s, the period that we associate with neoliberalism. Finally, lest we give too much credit to the academics and the researchers and the lawyers, there's a long tradition of community activist organizing. There have been May Day celebrations against precarity in Europe for decades. And there's a tradition of kind of both research and organizing against precarité, which drew on, but didn't directly originate with the work of the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who was actually studying the experiences of Algerian workers in a French colonial context and noticing the multiple ways in which racialized workers were excluded from employment protections, well-paid jobs, etc. So there's a whole body of really important work that emerges directly out of organizing against precarious employment, but that also includes really diverse movements for things like housing and tenant rights, that includes struggles, for language rights, for food security. It includes feminist and abolitionist organizing against incarceration, for example, anti-racist land back and status for all movements, and then queer liberation and other civil rights type of movements. So kind of all three of these different approaches in different ways inform a lot of the ways that we think about precariousness and precarity now, as well as our organizing strategies against it. So as I said, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about the work that we've been trying to do to understand precarious employment in particular in BC better. So in about 2016, 2017, myself, Iglika Ivanova, whom Luis mentioned, who's the senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Vancouver, and a coalition of migrant rights and union activists, including representatives from both public and private unions. So we had folks from CUPE, from BCGEU, from SEIU, from Unite Here around the table. And we were talking about kind of the anecdotal sense that, temporary employment contracts, that below standard pay, that a lack of benefits were increasing kind of across different areas of work. But we were feeling frustrated by the fact that our main sources of statistical data, so the labor force survey and the census, weren't giving us data on things that we thought we needed to know to understand the spread of precariousness. So the labor force survey didn't collect good and comprehensive sociodemographic data. It had no data on race, for example, at that time that could be cross-tabulated with some of the employment data. And it didn't collect good data on things like access to benefits, multiple job holding, and it had a limited way of understanding temporary contracts. So the conclusion that we came to is we actually didn't really understand how pervasive precarious employment is in BC and what its impacts are on BC communities. So our kind of partners around the table, including the unions and the Labor Studies program, were able to kind of mobilize some funds to actually fund a pilot survey that we ran in 2019 in November and December, so literally just before the COVID-19 pandemic. And that actually ended up being really fortuitous timing because we ended up with a snapshot of the BC labor market right at the time when the labor market was supposed to be at its strongest point for many years. So there was historically low unemployment. There was an upward trend in wages. Things in BC were supposed to be pretty rosy at that time. Now, just a couple of sort of things about how we approached this. We defined and studied precarious employment in BC in two ways. And I'll come on to what this means in a minute because it'll give you a bit of a sense of some of the possibilities, but also some of the limitations around how we understand precarious employment. So on the one hand, we asked all of the workers in our sample, we sampled over 3,000 workers, about the aspects of their job that aligned with the standard employment relationship. And I'll describe what that is. But then we also asked a whole series of additional questions, the kinds of questions that weren't on the labor force survey, including questions about effects on people's health of their work, community impacts, so whether people were able to participate in community activities or afford school supplies for their children, for example. And we asked them questions about things like housing and their ability to meet day-to-day and month-to-month expenses. And so out of those additional questions, we created an index that incorporates 10 direct and indirect measures of employment security. And so this pilot survey was really important because the data that came out of it really suggested that there was a need to understand precarious employment better and in more depth and with more nuance in BC. And it was out of that we were able to successfully apply for the Understanding Precarity in BC partnership, which is a 6 to 7 year community academic research partnership involving unions, community organizations, activist groups, and academic and non-academic researchers. And it's funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So in order to actually be able to do this survey and to be able to come up with the questions that we wanted to ask people, we had to figure out how we were going to define precarious employment to begin with. So as I mentioned, there are whole bodies of research that have tried to study and define precarity in a variety of ways. And there's no single agreed upon definition, which is a bit of a problem when you're creating a questionnaire survey, right? So we had to look at a big body of research that was out there, and we had to figure out what questions we wanted to ask. But the other thing we wanted to do was be able to do some comparative work. We wanted to be able to understand the ways that precarious employment might look the same or be different in BC from other places. So I'm taking a bit of time to go through this because as I start to tell you about what we found, I want you to understand what we were actually able to measure. So the first thing that we did was we asked people, as I mentioned, questions that helped us determine whether they were in what's called a standard job or a standard employment relationship. And this is just a quote from the report that came out of that first survey called "But Is It a Good Job?", where we defined what the standard employment relationship is. So it says, the SER came to be characterized as a lifelong, continuous, full-time employment relationship where the worker has one employer and normally works on the employer's premises or under his or her direct supervision. Other aspects of the SCR include collective representation, so at least the right or ability to unionize, and at least some employment-related benefits and entitlements. So the reason this is called the standard employment relationship is because this was sort of considered the gold standard for employment in the post-war period, including in Canada. And it's also associated with what we sometimes refer to as the male breadwinner model. So the idea that you should have one family supporting job that can, as the term suggests, actually economically support a family. Now, because of the gendered division of labor in the post-war period, it was a male worker who was normally assumed to be the person in this job. So in that sense, the standard employment relationship was always normative. It was always something that was held up as the sort of thing to be desired, but it also meant that it didn't apply to everyone. And so we need to be quite clear that the standard employment relationship, although we call it standard, didn't necessarily or wasn't necessarily accessible, for example, to many women workers, to racialized and Indigenous workers, to some immigrant workers. And one of the things that unions historically have fought really hard for is the extension of this kind of job to constituencies of people like women who didn't traditionally have access to it. So in that sense, the right to a family supporting job was a really important normative part of the standard employment relationship. And so one of the things we wanted to understand was to what extent has this norm been eroded in Canada and in BC? So the really foundational work in Canada on this was actually done mostly by feminist political economists in the 1990s. So people like Leah Bosco, who's a sociologist, in Ontario, and a lot of the work was focused on Ontario and Quebec. Relatively little research focused on British Columbia. And so that was one of the things we were setting out to remedy. So in our study, we defined the standard employment relationship as having a full-time job, having job stability, and having access to benefits. Now, you might notice that part-time jobs are excluded from this. And as I'll come on to, there are gendered implications to that because women are more likely than men to work part-time because of caregiving responsibilities. And it's important to say that there are part-time jobs that are well-paid, secure jobs with benefits. It's also true, though, that part-time work is less likely on average to be well-paid, to have access to benefits, and to be unionized. So that's the main reason that it tends to be excluded. And again, the part-time jobs that are those good quality, well-paid, permanent jobs are often in the public sector and are often unionized. Okay, so what did we find when we actually went out and asked sort of 3,000 plus workers across BC whether they had this kind of job or not? Well, the first thing to say is that in 2019, at the height of this really strong job market, only 49% of workers in our sample were in a standard job defined in that way. So it was just under half. It varied, though, depending on which group of workers we asked. So about 60% of recent immigrants, Indigenous workers, and racialized women were in non-standard jobs. So particular groups of workers were more likely than that average. The other thing we discovered, which was quite important to, I mean, I'm trained as a geographer, so kind of the geographies of employment are always of interest to me. And it was very clear to me that one of the limitations of previous research was that it had almost exclusively focused on metropolitan areas. So there's been a lot of research done in the GTA, for example, the Greater Toronto area. And there had been some research done in Metro Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland, and some research done in cities like Montreal. But relatively little was known about precarious employment outside of the big metropolitan areas. And one of the things that we found were that it wasn't that precarious employment is an urban problem. It's actually the case that there's this uneven geography of standard and non-standard work. Now, for all of you in this room living here or studying here, this might not be a big surprise, right? That the local economy is different from the economy in the Lower Mainland. But it was interesting to look at regionally. So in Metro Vancouver, there was the highest level of standard employment, and the interior had the lowest levels of standard employment. So it had the highest proportion of workers in non-standard jobs. Non-standard jobs were also more likely to be low paid and less secure, which is unsurprising. But it's just important to point this out because income was not one of the indicators of standard employment relationship. So in other words, just because a job was low paid, if it met all of the other criteria, we didn't exclude it. But there is a very clear relationship between non-standard work and low pay. So even though we didn't use low pay to define non-standard work, those people in non-standard jobs were much more likely to have lower incomes. And then finally, and this was a really interesting finding, a significant number of standard jobs, full-time, continuing jobs with benefits, I'll come on to the unionization because unionization does make a difference here. But a significant number of those jobs included characteristics that were associated with precarity. So although they met the general criteria for standard employment, many people would, in the survey, indicated, for example, that they might have access to one benefit, but not to the range of benefits we might associate. So the highest or the main benefit that people had was some kind of extended medical, but relatively few people had access to a pension, for example, especially in the private sector versus the public sector. People also had things like non-standard hours. They didn't know their schedule ahead of time, so their schedule would be given to them week to week. People had a lot of variability around their earnings, and those were all in standard jobs. So one of the things that we realized is that it's not just about whether a job is characterized as precarious or not, but rather that we were seeing potentially an increase in precarity in standard jobs. So in other words, employers were eroding the conditions of work, in particular through not offering benefits and also through holding pay down for the obvious reasons, right? To increase profits and to keep labor costs down. So this is just a little bit of a summary. That's a graphic from the report that kind of summarizes those trends. But as we see, unionization was a significant factor both in job quality and in the levels of secure work. Okay. So then we ran the study again just in the last spring. So in almost exactly a year ago, we increased our sample size to just over 4,000. And we we surveyed workers again across the province. And this was our first time doing this since COVID hit. And we had some quite interesting results. So the first thing to say is that standard employment has increased, actually. So if this were one of my classes, I would ask you to put your hands up and tell me why you think secure employment has increased. But since Luis said as I said, I wasn't tasked with giving tests in this talk. So instead, I'll tell you why. We've heard a lot about tight labor markets since COVID. And in particular, we had a period in which migration and immigration decreased. We had a number of years when people were not able to come into the country as easily as they had been. So we had a period in which the sort of power dynamic to an extent within the labor market shifted in favor of workers. So the result was, when we asked in the spring of 2023 how many workers were in secure employment, we had 59% of workers who reported being in a standard job and only 41% who reported not being in a standard employment relation. So that was a decrease of around 10% of people who were in non-standard employment. So quite significant. That said, there are still significant omissions in terms of who has access to the most secure jobs. The first really significant finding, which we need to delve into in more detail in the data because we've only done our preliminary analysis, is that Indigenous workers actually decreased their share of standard or secure employment. So this tight labor market did not benefit Indigenous workers. Now, one of the things that we need to look into in terms of examining relationships within the data is to what extent this might be associated with the location of those workers, because there's still a geographical difference, as I'll come on to, in where secure employment is most likely to be found in the province. But the other thing that we found that was really interesting is that actually the share of white workers in non-standard employment was higher than the share of racialized workers in non-standard employment. And that is an absolute reversal of what we have seen in a lot of the literature to date. So if we look historically, we see that non-secure employment tends to be racialized and feminized. And we've actually seen something of a shift in that. Now, what we need to do, and haven't done yet, is we really need to look at the relationship between standard and non-standard work and income. Because one of the things that may have happened in this period is that white workers, in particular more highly skilled and educated workers, have chosen to take temporary contract work because it's higher paid. And racialized workers who may not have as much bargaining power within the labor market may be more inclined to stay in secure full-time permanent jobs. There's also a sectoral element to this, which I'll come on to. But one of the things that will be important in terms of looking at income, as I've just mentioned, and I'm going to provide a little bit more kind of on this in the background, is that we've also in this period seen a continued trend of increasing income and wealth polarization, which is racialized. So as in those benefits have gone disproportionately to people who identify as white. So there's some interesting things going on. One of the things I'm hearing from healthcare unions, which it'll be interesting and maybe this will come up in the discussion, is that since COVID, a growing proportion of workers are choosing to work temporary contracts because of how difficult working conditions are in the healthcare sector. So you, instead of, for example, being in a permanent position as a nurse, you may choose to be in a temporary contract or to work on call because it means you don't have to be there every day working overtime under very difficult conditions. So we've got more investigation to do into this, but it's interesting that COVID has upended some of the very long-standing trends that we've seen in the labor market. The other thing that's interesting is, for once, it's not younger workers who are more likely to be in precarious employment. So the COVID labor market, for at least for workers over the age of 25, so we excluded workers under the age of 25 because of the likelihood of being a student. And so for workers over the age of 25, and this may come with a glimmer of hope for those of you who are going to be graduating soon, actually increased the share of secure employment, whereas older workers, so workers between the ages of 45 and 65, were actually more likely to be in insecure employment. And again, this reverses a very long-standing trend that has seen younger workers as being much more likely to be in precarious employment than older workers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given some of the impacts of COVID on caregiving, and I say this as someone with 3 children who were out of school for periods of time during COVID, women and people who identify as gender diverse are still more likely to be in non-standard jobs. So it suggests that caregiving burdens and responsibilities are still limiting the access of in particular feminized workers to standard employment. And that investments in childcare, for example, that the government has made and started to implement are not yet significantly shifting the extent to which women can work standard jobs. And then finally, immigration status still matters. So 64% of temporary residents are, unsurprisingly, so people who are not here, don't have PR or are not citizens, identify as being in non-standard employment. And in some ways, we would actually expect this to be higher because, in a sense, by virtue of not being permanent, by virtue of being on a temporary visa, you are precarious in certain ways. However, it does suggest that, and some of the migration and immigration numbers bear this out, that the workers coming in the highest skilled categories have a pretty good likelihood of expecting to be in the same job and being able to transfer to PR and to eventual citizenship, which is why we don't see a higher proportion of temporary residents in this insecure category. Okay. So I'm going to sort of start to kind of wrap up this very data-heavy part, but hopefully this has kind of given a bit of a sense of kind of what the lie of the land is in relation to understandings of kind of precarity and work in BC. And so I'll just kind of conclude with these, or this part of the talk, with these kind of summary tables. So again, as we can see, there's an interesting and somewhat unusual distribution of work by racialized identity in that first chart there, kind of on the left, which suggests that in particular, we still see the highest levels of non-standard and precarious work among Indigenous workers. But we can see that the category of white workers who identify as white is also influenced by the proportion of workers who identify as white who've come through some kind of temporary immigration program or who are immigrants. But this is the table that I want to draw your attention to, because I think this also says something significant. And that is, perhaps unsurprisingly, but it's very much borne out in the data, it really matters what sector you're employed in. So arts, entertainment, and recreation has low levels of unionization, for one thing, but it's also a sector in which the prevalence of gig work is very high. So if you're a musician or an actor, but also, for example, if you work in the film industry in Vancouver and do effects for a living, you're very likely to be on temporary contracts or to be self-employed, treated as an independent contractor. It's also a sector that is whiter than the sectors that follow. So accommodation and food services and construction are more diverse in terms of how workers identify, their racialized identity. But arts, entertainment, and recreation is quite a white sector. We see, unsurprisingly, that some of the sectors that have higher levels of unionization or education are the sectors with lower levels. Agriculture, we kind of need to ignore because it includes very low numbers of workers and unfortunately gets lumped in with utilities and manufacturing because most workers in agriculture are precarious. But the sort of takeaway message from that graph or that chart is really that sector matters a lot. And so this is something we also need to think about when we think about organizing and when we think about solidarity work, is that the sectors that are most likely to be unionized and most likely to be often, although not exclusively in the public sector, are the ones that have relatively high levels of good quality and secure employment. And then it's the sectors that we know are hard to organize and the sectors that have historically low levels of unionization where we continue to see higher levels of non-standard employment. Okay. So having taken you on a kind of whistle-stop tour of what secure and insecure employment looks like in BC, I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit. As I do that, I'm going to talk about how I think, at least, we kind of need to be thinking about and contextualizing these trends. So there are really important ways in which this kind of research can help us think about things like organizing strategies in particular sectors. They can help us think about potential policy or legislative solutions that might include things like sectoral bargaining. So sectoral bargaining, for example, is when you take a sector that has historically low levels of unionization and that is difficult to organize because workers are often isolated or there's high turnover, and you set agreements across that sector, ideally with unions or worker representatives at the table to do that. So there are a whole variety of kind of policy and legislative measures that we can be thinking about and arguing for. The regulation of app-based gig work is, app-based ride, hail, and delivery work would be another example. But what I kind of want to argue is that if we're thinking about precarity really not just as a description of good or bad work, but actually as a kind of political concept or a concept that has political potential, we need to think about it a little bit more broadly and a little bit more kind of politically. So I'm going to talk about the kind of political economy, highlighting economy, within which we need to understand these employment trends. The first thing we need to be conscious of, and the thing that we need to be thinking through in our efforts around organizing, is that we're still struggling with declining rates of union density, in particular in the private sector in BC. So union coverage in BC fell from around 37% in 1997 to just over 30% in 2023. And that masks huge variation between the public and private sectors. So in 2016, it was only 17% in the private sector. So our ability to organize, which has been made easier by the card check, the reintroduction of card check, but the difficulty in sectors like, for example, food services that are highly franchised, where we have multiple small locations, our existing framework for labor relations does not make it easy to unionize these kinds of establishments and keep them unionized and actually get a first contract. But we also need to remember that there are people who are really benefiting in our current economy from these trends. So in 2023 in BC and in Canada, the highest income households had the greatest gains in employment and investment income. So this is also a period in which the richest households were also getting richer. In 2016 in BC, 40% of households owned almost 90% of all of the housing wealth in the province associated with a primary residence. And that has only gotten worse since the pandemic. At the same time, we've had an economy in which we've had record high, well, at least in the last few decades, for those who can remember much higher interest rates back in the 70s. But if we think in the last couple of decades, we've had in the last few years, historically high levels of inflation, which disproportionately impact lower income households. So if you're a lower income household, you spend a greater proportion of your income on things like rent and groceries. And so not only have we seen high inflation, but we see the costs of that inflation being unequally distributed. What that means is people in general are pessimistic and pissed off. So this comes from polling that the BC Federation of Labor does monthly, these are the kind of details of their sample size. They sample around 1,500 BC residents, and the sample is weighted to the 2021 census. And they ask people, how they're feeling about how things are going, whether they're happy with what the government's doing. And so there are a couple of things we can take from this. People generally, and again, this is unsurprising because we hear a lot about this in a kind of general political sense, people feel that things are going in the wrong direction. People have relatively low trust in politicians, and we're seeing a continued rise of conservatism. When you ask voters what their priorities are, perhaps unsurprisingly, we see affordability, housing, and healthcare. And issues like climate, poverty, and homelessness come way down. So the reason there's a line there is there's a significant gap between the third priority and the fourth priority in terms of how people rank them and how many people say they're important. And of course, while we think about housing and healthcare as being kind of areas in which progressive policies, could really resonate with voters, we also have to remember that this is an environment in which arguments about low taxes can also really take hold. So what do we do in a political sense about the problems of precarity as both an economic and a political phenomenon that has significant social implications? We now have more than 2 decades of research that tells us a variety of things. So those of us who are academics, we do a lot of research that often pretty much tells us the same thing over and over again. So we know these things to be true. We know that non-standard work is feminized. We know that legal status and immigration status really matters. We know that the sector and industry are strongly related to the prevalence of secure work, and we know that gender diverse and queer workers have higher levels of precarious employment. We also know that some of the biggest disparities that have grown in the last few decades are among work groups of workers like women and queer workers. So some workers in those categories are doing very well, and some are really struggling. So we're seeing polarization within groups as well as between groups. And there are definitely still some questions that we need to know more about. We need to know more about geographies of precarious employment. We need to understand the relationship of racialization to precarious employment. And by racialization, I mean racialization as a process in and through which racial categories are constructed and reproduced. So not just whether people identify as belonging to a particular race or not, but how racialization operates in our economy. And we really need to understand more about the struggles of Indigenous workers. Indigenous workers on reserve, off reserve, in urban communities, and throughout our province. So, precarious work is intrinsic to capitalism, but capitalism is also prone to crisis. And we are in the middle at the moment of what kind of political economists and academics like to call conjunctural crises. In other words, we have a number of intersecting crises that impact our social, economic, and political systems with significant intersecting and interlocking social consequences. So we can name them, right? We've got climate change and multiple ecological crises. We've got a cost of living crisis. We've got a healthcare crisis. We've got a housing crisis. We have generally a kind of disinformation and political trust crisis. But we also need to ask ourselves, as I mentioned, crises for whom? Because at the same time, we've got certain groups and people, and certainly corporations, have gotten a lot wealthier, including during the pandemic. And one of the causes of inflation is actually corporate profits, not wages. We also need to remember that that Indigenous, Black, and racialized scholars, including post-colonial and decolonial scholars, have made the point that Indigenous, Black, and racialized groups have been living with crisis and apocalypse for centuries. So we need to ask ourselves what counts as a crisis for whom, and what are our political solidarities that come out of the notion of crisis. So I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about this slide, but what I want to argue is that we need to understand precarious employment in a context that understands capitalism as racial capitalism and as a social and economic system that is co-produced in and through relations of settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy. And so we need to understand it as being embedded within a set of macro structural conditions that directly produce the individual and group exploitation and oppression that people feel as precarity as individuals and in their communities. And that is the challenge. It's more than a regulatory challenge. It's more than a challenge of policy. It's a true political challenge. And I want to just talk for a minute about what I think is interesting about the moment that we're in, as somebody who's both a labor scholar and an activist. I think in addition to conjunctural crisis, we're also seeing something a bit like conjunctural organizing. So when I go to my local Palestine Solidarity rally in Victoria, which is where I live, I am there both as an academic, but also as a member of the Labor for Palestine group. When I'm at those rallies, I'm talking to Indigenous allies, I'm talking to migrant rights activists. All of us are engaged in that struggle, which we understand as struggles against racial capitalism, against imperialism, and against settler colonialism. Similarly, when my community, the queer community, is targeted by transphobic activists, anti-SOGI protests, I see the flying squad organized by the BC Federation of Labor and my union brothers and sisters out there counter-protesting with me against those policies that we have seen producing such detrimental impacts in Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Alberta. And what I'm seeing in that sense is understandings and organizing against precarity that are based on coalitional, intersectional struggles that understand and, in a sense, embody an open and intersectional understanding of class and the working class, and take seriously the multiple identities that we have as workers and as activists in our communities. And so I just want to conclude with a couple of kind of thoughts or provocations. I would say that in order to truly tackle precarity in a time of conjunctural crisis, and in order for conjunctural organizing or coalitional organizing to be necessary, we really need an analysis of the state and of capital that understands how they relate to each other. In other words, we need to understand the way governments and corporations work together and the ways in which that prevents, but also sometimes offers opportunities for advocating for policy and legislative change that makes the lives of working people better, but also that there are inherent limits sometimes to those strategies because challenging corporate power is really hard, and it's hard for governments to do. And, when we understand their interrelationship as part of the coevolution with settler colonialism and racial capitalism and imperialism, it makes sense that it's hard. The other thing I would say is that I am feeling increasingly like we can't cede ground on identity. The right loves to use identity politics and wokeism as a way of kind of attacking intersectional struggles that take people's identities seriously. And I would argue that we can understand and respect the importance of identity and the way that people's identities relate to their communities and their relationships and their understanding and desire for a good and dignified life without identitarian approaches. And what I mean by that is approaches, for example, that see race again just as a box that you tick on the census, but also in ways that avoid identitarian politics, which is the name given to the kind of white right-wing politics of white supremacy and ethno-nationalism. And finally, the labor movement has worked incredibly hard since the beginning of capitalism to establish norms of what good and decent and livable work is. And the only ways in which we have made work better and fought against precarity within capitalism is through struggle. What I would say, though, is that we can have norms of decent work and norms that are rooted in justice without having an idea of what a normative or who a normative worker is. We have to understand that we are not going to win as a movement if the normative worker has to be a citizen, for example, or the normative worker has to be white. So we don't need to let go of norms, but we need to be very careful of the ways in which we think about workers normatively. And I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that will set us up for some questions and comments and possibly some disagreement. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Strauss, for that very engaging and challenging and exciting presentation. And we have time for questions. I'll pass around the mic if you have questions, and let's get it started. It's always difficult. The first, oh no, it's not that difficult. There we go.
I take it you're aware of the review of the British Columbia Labor Code that's underway now. Are you making submissions, or is SFU making submissions to that?
Yeah, great question. We are, and we're working actually through Up BC. We're working with the BC Federation of Labor and other unions to, in a sense, come up with coordinated submissions that are trying to make some similar arguments. And this is where, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm not in any way dismissing the importance of these opportunities to make the labor code or employment standards better. I think it's likely that what we're going to find is that changes to the labor code are going to be pretty incremental. And I think there are some really strong arguments being made for example, sectoral bargaining, or at least agreements that cover particular sectors, so norm and wage setting. I don't think we're going to get it. But what I would say, even beyond the opportunity to take part in these things, I think some of the ways in which we come together around these opportunities are also really good opportunities for coalition building within the labor movement. So yeah.
And just potentially two questions, if you'll indulge me. First question I had is, I've grown up in the Okanagan all my life, and the one thing that I didn't realize until I was a little bit older, when I started looking at more census data and actual some reports, is that we have a very high level of self-employment in the valley. And I'm just very curious as to how that integrated into some of your data and how, if I, for instance, and this is not me, but I'll just use an example. If I'm somebody who runs an Airbnb and I've got 2 or 3 properties, I think we've realized over the last year that a lot of those people maybe are precarious and didn't realize it in a way, right? But I'm curious, how did you classify them?
Yeah, so they don't enter into our sample at all because they are classified as self-employed. But I think what you identify is a really interesting and important challenge because we've seen, and again, I'm glad you raised this particular issue because I didn't talk about it, but it is something that we're looking at. We've actually seen increasing levels of self-employment as well as independent contractor status, which relates also to app-based gig work. And so part of what the challenge is, I think, for the labor movement is how do we build a sense of solidarity and shared identity across these categories when people don't necessarily think of themselves as workers. They think of themselves as entrepreneurs. So I don't have an answer for you other than to say that they were excluded from this sample. But the question of how we can involve them in some of our arguments and movements for kind of progressive social change, I think is a really important issue for the labor movement.
Okay, and then maybe on a second, so in February this year, we saw the biggest company in the world by market cap, I guess you could put it this way, actually became a company called NVIDIA that actually makes chips that are really exceptional at doing artificial intelligence. And they make companies like Walmart look small at this point. And there's some talk that artificial intelligence is like the next printing press. It is the next COVID. It is. And when I looked at some of the charts of the professions you had, I noticed that some of them near the bottom of the list are actually, for maybe the first time ever, or potentially in the crosshairs of an artificial intelligence wave that could produce a teacher or a doctor or something in that regard. And I'm curious how you think that actually influences precarity, because a lot of it comes from our power in the workplace to just negotiate our terms of employment, right? So what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's the big question that everybody's grappling with right now. I think if we look at historical trends, and in this sense, if there are historians in the room, they might have insights. But I think what we know is that technological change often doesn't have the impacts that we think it will in the ways and in the time that we think it will. What's likely to happen is that artificial intelligence, the uptake of it is probably going to be less smooth than companies would like. And what's going to happen is there's going to have to be a lot of oversight. And so I use ChatGPT in my teaching. I get my students to write things on ChatGPT, and then we critique them together. And we do it using the readings and things from the course. And in a sense, that may well herald what my job eventually becomes, right? Is to take that technology and to say, okay, well, you can get it to answer a question, but how good is the answer? What does it lead? I mean, the problem is it will then have more fodder to train itself on. But yeah, but I think in the sense of challenging some of those more high status, highly paid occupations that are quite well protected right now, I think it's a huge change that they're very worried about. I think we don't know yet what those impacts will be. I think it's probably going to take longer than we think. And then, in the meantime, it will be interesting to see how relatively high status and high powered workers seek to protect their sectors.
I want to ask, is British Columbia special or exception among other provinces? If so, for example, British Columbia hold most of NDP members in the federal parliament. I want to ask, is such cognition of labor struggle making such a situation?
Yeah, it's interesting because BC has not historically had, if you go back, I mean, BC has had a very radical labor movement.
Yeah. But
So did Alberta, though.
Yeah.
So the question, I think, where I'm going with that is, and I think your question is, why is BC the way it is today, and how does it compare with other provinces? Is that right?
Yes, and because it is interesting, because early the 20th century, like first half of the 20th century till maybe 1917, British Columbia is governed by more right-wing populists
Mhm.
of Social Credit
Yeah.
Party, and now today it becomes more like a headquarter of Canadian left wings.
Yeah. Well, and in some ways, what's interesting about that is that's a reversal of what we've seen in the prairie provinces,
Yes,
for
yes.
example. So there are probably a variety of explanations. Some people put it down to sectoral change. So as resource industries have decreased and the economy has diversified, it's brought different kinds of workers into BC. Even though the resource sector has quite a radical kind of organizing history, but then when we see things like the role of oil production in Saskatchewan, there's this sense that it's partly this sectoral thing that's happening. There's also some discussion, although I haven't seen much actual empirical research, that suggests that it's partly about a self-sustaining kind of myth of what BC is. So people move here in part because they think it's a more kind of outdoorsy, lefty, liberal kind of place. One thing I would say is we can't homogenize BC though, because BC has huge regional variations. So on the island where I am, it's a real NDP stronghold, but the same is not true in, parts of the interior and the north, for example. And the lower mainland is hugely divided between left, conservative, and liberal, kind of constituencies. So I think that it's a question probably of kind of change over time, kind of political and economic change over time. I think some of it is reinforcing in terms of who chooses to move here and who goes elsewhere. And then, I think some of it is just, we also have an NDP that is quite centrist. So, and we don't have a far right party, like the Liberals are the right, although they've now rebranded themselves in a way that nobody knows who they are. But it's a really interesting question. Yeah. I don't have a great answer for it. Sorry.
If I may, in the interior, at least in the Okanagan, it seems to be the reverse. Up until the 1960s, and so it was NDP or precursor to NDP stronghold, and it's gone right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the reverse of what's happening in the province.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming, Kendra. Wonderful, wonderful lecture. Enjoyed every minute.
Oh, good.
I'm one of those people that came from Vancouver and moved to the Okanagan. So when you talk about the Okanagan being different and not having the kind of work that you normally would have in Vancouver, that is so true. And of course, I've spent quite a bit of time in the construction industry because I was with the Building Trades Council for many years. And I got an insight into what construction workers did and the fact that they were working in the unions, getting their apprenticeship properly. That was in 72. So I go back a ways when the NDP government first came in.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful. They were getting trained. They were getting their their tickets. They were doing things properly. Now I'm hoping when this labor code comes into effect, we might do something a little bit different to help these young people get a proper apprenticeship so they can get their tickets, they can earn wages. We need them. And they have to be properly trained. We do not need any more accidents like we had in the crane here a few years ago and also down at the coast. So I'm just hoping and praying that things will change in that way. And that things will get better. The Okanagan is a wonderful place to live, but they're not used to having decent wages. And the other thing that bothers me is all the people that are working on their own. They're self-employed. And you know what? Unless they get out there and highball, they don't make any money. So sorry, that's not the way to go. Do it right. Get your trade, join a union, and go out and get a job that you'll enjoy.
Yeah, and that's safe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Think person behind you.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the way you framed the normative or standard employment relation as exceptional globally and historically. But there's also a sense in which, so it's exceptional, but then our definition of precarious labor is a catch-all of everything else.
Absolutely.
And it's not all the same. People have referenced different ways in which there's different kind of exceptional categories within it. Although for the record, I kind of think hospital doctors are precarious. They get paid a lot, but they don't get benefits and they're kind of precarious. So my point is, not all precarious labor is the same. And especially it's not the same as, say, seasonal employment that, fits our definition of precarious labor, but historically was more flexible and less precarious, right? Having 5 job descriptions was a good thing at some point in time.
Yeah.
So we've focused on the symptoms that we can measure in the surveys, which I totally respect. But what's the internal mechanism? Like, what is capitalism trying to do that ultimately makes these precarious?
Well, I mean, I think, what we probably need to understand, and I've made this argument elsewhere, is that in some senses, the post-war period was quite an exceptional period. So when I say that labor under capitalism is inherently precarious, what I mean is the periods in which we've established norms and conditions of decent work has been both through worker struggle and often through kind of geopolitical. So post-war rebuilding was a significant part of how and why, organized labor was able to successfully embed norms of decent employment in the post-war World War II social compromise. And so I think that there are a couple of answers to that. I mean, I think that there's always a desire to hold wages down. There's always a desire, and we're seeing it now with the increase in temporary migration in Canada, to not only hold wages down, but also to ensure, in a sense, that workers' security does not become an impediment to accumulation, right? But I think that we also capitalism isn't a hegemonic system. So what we have is different kind of fractions of capital that are using different strategies in order to benefit their own particular kind of regime of accumulation that they have. I mean, that's not quite the right, but I think you know what I'm getting at. So the ways in which accumulation and profit works with it, and they don't always match up neatly with one another. It's not a system that is perfectly coherent. So I think what we're seeing is, in this period that we kind of identify broadly as neoliberalism, a period in which there's been regulatory and political change in favor of capital that has enabled conditions that have made workers more precarious. So we've seen employment standards and labor standards rolled back. We've seen forms of de and re-regulation that benefit capital. We've seen capital mobility and all of these things. The utility of the category of precarious work is, I think, a really valid point, because I think one of the things we need to understand, and surveys will tell us this to a certain degree, but this is what I was getting at when I said we need to understand is that this is a political problem, not just an empirical problem, is what are the actual implications of these changes in the forms and norms of work that we're talking about. And I would argue that part of what we're seeing politically in terms of right-wing populism and other things is connected to precarity in the labor market and a sense of insecurity and loss that is stronger in particular communities and in particular sectors. So that would be my I don't have a perfect answer, but that's probably the best I can do. I don't know. What would you say?
Well, I guess I'd say, I suppose, I don't know, but I'd say it's easier to define it in sort of its corollary because it's easier to define the good jobs.
Yeah.
And those are the jobs with unions. And it seems like all the other ones have something in common.
Yeah. Although the one thing I would say, which is really challenging, in the context of organized labor, is that we have unfortunately seen unionized jobs take on. I mean, the jobs in the BC civil service are actually a good example of this. We've seen the expansion of temporary contracts, for example, in sectors that are still unionized. And so you're absolutely right, but that it's also unions have managed to protect the kind of qualities or the job quality, but some of the elements of security have gone by the wayside. On the other hand, we're sure lucky to have pensions, those of us who are in unions, because this is another area of my research. And for those of you who are young enough not to be thinking about retirement yet, you probably don't know how much of an enormous boon it is to have a public, or a defined benefit pension, which is a collectivized pension. But man, that's something we're going to really, really see the implications of low levels of pension coverage in the private sector. And that's why people are betting on housing, because people want to be able to retire from property wealth. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, when you look at the government sector and how low precarity is in that sector, does that impact political change because they don't relate to precarity?
Yeah, I think that would be a great question to ask, some of our brothers and sisters in unions like BCGEU, who because it is true that it's different within, or our union siblings. It's different within sectors that are within the public sector where there's very high union density. There's been a lot of debate, and some of you who, are labor activists and scholars will know that there's been a lot of debate about organizing, about whether and how unions organize. And I think one of the things that's true is in sectors where there's very high levels of unionization in the public sector, for example, the cultures of organizing are very different. And it's also hard because workers, in a sense, don't have to think in the same way about whether they get those benefits. That said, we saw, for example, the Liberal government that was in power. I mean, it was a little while ago now. But if we look at the period of like 2002 to 2015, they really tried to make inroads in the unionization in the public sector. And they did things like create far more classes of workers that were excluded. So make people managers so that they won't be in the union. So it does have political implications. It does matter. And I think one of the struggles sometimes for unions, especially some of the really big public sector unions, is to see themselves as organizations that need to organize, because it's not always part of the culture. And that has implications for workers too, and whether they see themselves as workers. So does that kind of answer your question? Yeah, okay.
So, what percentage of workers are choosing to be precarious because it matches their lifestyle, the higher contracts, and the freedom of being able to work when you want to work?
Yeah. So we decided not to ask that question directly, because what we know is that a lot of workers, choice is a tricky one. It's the same as asking a parent who can't work full time, or many parents will say, mothers in particular, that they choose not to work full time because of childcare, but it's often because they don't have access to decent childcare. So I think that there is absolutely a stratum of workers who are often workers in sectors, and that actually does include workers in the trades, for example, who might choose to be self-employed, who have skills and bargaining power within the labor market where they just know they can make more money. The downside, though, and it's interesting because we're seeing it with doctors actually, in terms of the desire to have systems or options for salary, is that you don't have the security and you definitely don't have benefits. And so for things like a pension, what we're seeing is there are particular groups of kind of younger and highly skilled workers who choose to be contractors. But then we're also seeing workers who are seeking out more secure forms of employment because in this really expensive economy and housing market and without an access to a pension, they might make more money, but they do have an understanding that they're less secure. So we don't know exactly what the proportion is. And we also know that people sometimes move in and out. So they'll be in a permanent job in finance and then they'll become a consultant and then they might move back in. But it's also tricky because what counts as choice is sometimes not that clear, if that makes sense. Yeah. It sounds a bit like I'm dodging the question, but.
I have a question. I wonder if you could expand a bit about solidarity building and making connections across borders. It seems that what you describe is pervasive, is expanding, and I'm wondering the resistance and how much of that is also sort of germinating across borders so that we're not sort of in our own little cocoons fighting a fight that takes a lot more effort to get to confront.
Yeah, and I think that this is where I think we've got really rich traditions of internationalism within the labor movement to build on. And so, when I mentioned kind of solidarity struggles, I'm hearing workers, for example, in the Workers for Palestine movement talking about, when workers after the Chilean coup refused, in Glasgow to service, the warplanes that Thatcher was going to send, to help Pinochet. And so I think that this is a moment in which organized labor and activists involved in these solidaristic and intersectional struggles really understand the need for organizing across borders. I think the problem is it's still really difficult to do. I think technology helps, but we know this from organizing on the ground. It's hard to not be in rooms with people and have conversations. And so the spaces for doing that, I think, are spaces of experimentation. We can think about the World Social Forum and all of these different fora over the years where we've experimented with this kind of coalition building. I think we were starting to see it in some ways around climate, and that may continue. But it's hard work. It's hard work. And in a period of kind of resurgent nationalism, I think unfortunately it's becoming harder in some ways, but I think it's also reinvigorated elements of an internationalist labor movement. That's my hope, because if kind of ethno-nationalism and populism is intent on dividing workers, then we absolutely need those international those international solidarities. Again, I'm not sure that answered your question, but I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
We've had a whole class on that.
Okay.
So.
Or maybe what some of your students
I
think.
thought I'd pop the question because my students are a bit shy, but we've had a whole conversation on. Any other questions?
Thank you. So it might be an expansion of my previous question.
Sure.
I know it's not in this lecture. I'm just curious about the other province in Canada. Like, what's their situation? Is there any difference from British Columbia?
In precarious work in particular? Because I think you did actually ask that and I didn't really answer it. But are you wondering in particular about precarity?
Yes. So
Yeah.
does it make the difference we discussed previous?
Yeah, I think there are definitely variations across Canada and provincially. So for example, when we did the survey in 2019, we followed a really similar methodology to a project called the PEPSO project, which was a kind of big project between organized labor and academics involving the United Way and others in the Greater Toronto area. And we found higher levels of precarious employment in BC than in Ontario at that time. The more recent research from Ontario suggests those trends have actually reversed. And so again, I think as a geographer, we always make the argument that we need to understand things on multiple levels or on multiple scales. And so there's a geographer and a political economist named Jamie Peck who used to talk about the importance of understanding local labor markets within national and global capitalisms. And I think that's quite true provincially within BC, that we see quite a bit of variation, part of which is sectoral, some of which is geographical in terms of proximity to the US. I mean, you know, Nunavut has very high levels of precarity, unsurprisingly, right? And there are a whole variety of reasons for that. And in addition to, you know, reasons to do with kind of colonialism and extractivism, it's also very, very far from markets, and costs of doing business are very, very high. So even as a kind of extractive capitalist economy, it's a challenge. So there's absolutely a geography to precarity within Canada, but it kind of needs to be looked at a variety of different scales. And I think we can see some trends in terms of kind of provincial patterns, but within provinces, there's also a lot of variation. And to go back to your first question, that manifests in different political cultures and climates within different provinces and regions as well. So I do think that there's a relationship there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I was just curious if in your research there was anything that speaks to the increase of minimum wage affecting precarity.
Yeah. That's a great question, because of course that's what the right loves to argue, is that a higher minimum wage leads to higher unemployment in particular. So we didn't look specifically at minimum wage and its impact on precarity. But what we do know, so my colleagues at the CCPA have done quite a lot of analysis, and there's absolutely no correlation between, and in fact, we see the opposite. We've seen the opposite in BC. Actually, unemployment has gone down as our minimum wage has gone up. I mean, I think that it's certainly possible that for some employers and in some sectors, particularly for small businesses, you know, a higher minimum wage can be a challenge. But there isn't a kind of broad pattern, thankfully, that we can identify that says that having a higher minimum wage is bad for the economy and bad for workers. And I think the argument that a higher minimum wage enables people to spend more and to be able to afford to spend more within their local economy is also true. So it's not in our study, but from what I know of the literature generally, I think we can say higher minimum wages are a good thing, especially with the cost of living crisis that, you know, in particular affects lower wage workers.
Okay, so before I thank Dr. Strauss, I'll remind you that we have a reception downstairs in the foyer, so please don't leave without eating something and having a drink and carrying on the conversation with Dr. Strauss or amongst ourselves. And then I want to thank Dr. Strauss for the work that you're doing that is so important and so relevant and so pertinent to the situation that we're in, and for delivering a very thought-provoking lecture that we can sort of think about for the next couple of weeks. Thank you so much.
For inviting me.